Hello, are we ready today? Well, we do have a long list, so I'm going to let him go, and I'm going to keep my remarks here short. I'm just going to advertise. We have an art show this afternoon from 2 to 4. It'll be our folks in Gallery and LEC showing off their stuff. So come up and join us, have a cookie, and see some artwork. Anyway, I'm going to turn it back over to Neale, and we're in the middle of Renaissance. We've done great series of lectures, and I'm just so excited to hear more. So welcome, Neale. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Last week, in my anxiety to get through the long list of works we were to look at, I neglected to thank Jen for her help and support with this series. And I hope you all realize none of this would happen had it not been for her effort and support. So I hope as you see her around campus, you'll all remember to thank her for this. Yeah, we're in the early Renaissance today. There are times when you're obligated to teach a subject and there's no resonance between that subject and your life. And so you have to find a way to carry on. Renaissance, of course, means new life or rebirth. And this week I've been reminded of my favorite Christmas carol. I mentioned this before. It's called In the Bleak Midwinter. Now this February is one of the least bleak Februaries I've ever seen, but a lot of us have not felt very well, partly because of this odd weather. I had a cold all week. My wife has a cold right now. I got a call from the Burtons this morning. They're not going to be here because they're not feeling well. So anyway, we're going to soldier on in the early Renaissance here, and it's going to be springtime in this room. We'll see. I'll do the best I can to get us there. Okay, well, here's what's going on in our lecture today. We're moving away from Northern Europe. We're moving to Italy. And we're looking at art in the 1400s. And the 1400s are really an important time in Italy, throughout Europe. And if you ask the average person, when did the Roman Empire fall apart? They'll usually tell you 400, 500 AD. In fact, the Roman Empire did not fall apart till the middle of the 1400s, 1453. The Roman Empire had moved to the east to a city named after Constantine, Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. And the Ottoman Turks finally conquered Istanbul in 1453. Now, why that's important is that all the major classical scholarship and texts and so on were in Constantinople. The Romans revered the Greeks. They revered their scholarship, they revered their philosophy, so they saved all of those ancient texts. Well, the academicians, the scholars, were chased out of Istanbul, and of course they went to Italy. So you get a revival, all of these ancient texts come into Italy, and so you get a revival of a classical way of thinking. And that's what we're going to see in the 1400s. The thing to keep in mind, though, is the Christian faith has emerged since that classical era, and now the classical way of thinking gets fused with Christian theology. And so new ways of thinking emerge in the 1400s. And one of the most significant of them we call Neoplatonism. Plato, among the classical schools of philosophy, there are two ways of thinking. You have the idealists, the people who want to believe in a perfect, absolute, almost heavenly vision of the world, and they're associated with Plato. Then you've got the empiricists, the people who are feet on this earth, let's get practical, let's get things done, let's invent technology and so on. They're associated with Aristotle. And Neoplatonism is a Christian philosophy that's based on classical philosophy, but basically what it does is connect physical beauty, because remember, as we move into the Renaissance, we saw this in the North last week, there's a new theology that's coming along. And the idea, it's no longer, the vision is no longer the kingdom of God up in heaven in those soaring spires of the Gothic cathedrals. The new vision is of God the Creator. And that in God's creation, He meets us here on earth. And His goodness and virtue can be embodied in creation. And so basically what you get as you create this into a amalgam sort of philosophy and perspective is that physical beauty becomes a metaphor for moral perfection. We tend to think of those things in rather separate ways, but the Renaissance didn't. So we're going to see a highly idealized art in the 1400s. And it doesn't just represent the physical world, it represents moral virtues at the same time. And you've got to realize that's the way they think about this. That's why all of a sudden they can start to show us nude bodies, which normally were verboten in most of Christian iconography, let alone, except with Adam and Eve. But now they'll start to go back to the nude body because it represents the perfection of God's creation. Okay, let's get started here with our first image. I think you're acquainted with the fact that the Italians think very highly of the baptismal rite in the church, so much so that they build baptistries outside of the church itself. The concept is you can't really truly enter the church unless you're properly baptized. And so in Florence, there is a very ancient building, the baptistry in front of the Duomo, which is a major Florentine cathedral, that's much older than the cathedral itself. In fact, it has, and I think I showed you when we looked at the Byzantine style, some amazing Byzantine mosaics inside of it. But during the Renaissance, they decided they wanted to update that building. The building has 3 sets of doors in it, and they wanted to create some new panels for the north doors of the baptistry. Now, keep in mind, in Italian churches, when we think of doors, we think of 7-foot high opening. We're talking 12, 15, 18 feet high, and massive, heavy things. Well, there was a competition to create some panels for the north doors of the baptistry. The two major artists that got in the finals of this competition were Ghiberti. Let's see, wait a minute. There. This is Ghiberti's panel, and Brunelleschi. The theme of both of them is the sacrifice of Isaac. Now, what you get here in these panels is a kind of war of styles that's going on in the 1400s. Ghiberti's panel has certain classical elements in it, most notably the body of Isaac, which is a classical nude, but the rest of it is more in a very fluid, graceful style that we've called in the past International Gothic. And the International Gothic style was very prominent. We're going to see a major altarpiece in a few panels that was part of the International Gothic style. And the International style was highly realistic, but it also had a lot of grace and fluidity to it. And you'll notice this sweeping rock configuration here. Here's the angel, Isaac, and of course, Jacob and Isaac. And then we have, I think, servants over here. And the ram is somewhere. Where's the ram? Way up here. Now, if you look at Brunelleschi's panel, it's rather different in character. You notice it looks simpler. One of the reasons it looks simpler is it has more of a geometric line to it. Notice how you're getting a kind of angular look here with the horse and the servant and so on over here. And here's your sacrificial lamb. If you look carefully at the Brunelleschian panel, here's the angel, of course, staying his sword. Notice you can find a pyramidal shape there. That's going to become a major theme in the Renaissance. The pyramid, of course, it's an equilateral kind of pyramid, so it represents a kind of stability. And one of the major goals of the early Renaissance is this idealistic quality of stability. It's not a broken, fallen world, even though this panel indicates some of the brokenness of creation. Anyway, this is the future. This won the competition. Both of them are very, very good. And as you see, there's a classic element that certainly enters into Ghiberti's work. Now, can we see the next one, please? Here's a view of the doors themselves. And here's one of the panels that Ghiberti made. This is the story of Jacob and Esau. And again, as I've mentioned, Ghiberti he sort of got a foot in both worlds. So he does the kind of things that we saw in Gothic art where you mix realities, you mix scales, you mix stories, and that's what he's doing here. This is the so-called Jacob cycle that we're looking at here. And way in the background, you get a very, very shallow presentation of the birth of Jacob and Esau, and then we have these women almost fully three-dimensional in various classic poses, standing here, sort of shepherding the boys into the world. Then you get this middle panel where Isaac is asking Esau to go hunting. The dogs are with him. Here's Esau, and he's going out into the world to hunt. You remember the story. He comes back. He's exhausted. Jacob is making some food, and Esau sells his birthright to Jacob for the sake of the food. And here you've got Isaac blessing Jacob, and the mother looking over the scene. Jacob is, of course, her favorite son. Anyway, I want you to notice the perspective. Sculpture at this point in time is in some ways more advanced than painting. You have this complicated classical architecture, and it's actually rendered in perspective that the loser of this competition invented. Brunelleschi is the guy who invented linear perspective. But Ghiberti used it, and you notice how believable this is. Now keep in mind, this is bronze, so it's real, and at the same time it's an illusion, because things get rendered in very, very minute depth to create these kind of illusions. And of course, here you see the entire set of panels. They're huge doors. They're gilded. They're bronze that has been gilded. The modern doors are reproductions. The original panels are in the museum, and the art history book I work from shows them in the Bargello, which is one of the major museums, but I think they've been moved to the Duomo Museum. Now, can we see the next one, please? I last time admitted a certain bias because of my own profession as a sculptor. And so you'll notice we're starting this series out with sculpture. And the premise I talked about last time is that sculpture is the heaviest, the slowest, the most expensive, the most cumbersome of art forms. When sculpture changes, you know there's big social changes going on because it takes a whole society to support the expense and so on of sculpture. And so we'll start to see that in the early Renaissance. Sculpture is the art form that tends to lead other art forms. There's a building outside of, or on the edge of Florence, that was originally a marketplace, and eventually they used it as a kind of meeting hall for the guilds. And remember, in late medieval society, the guilds develop, and these are associations of various crafts that become a part of the new, more secular world. Now, the Sculptors Guild created this particular niche in Or Saint-Michel, is the name of this church or this building. And this is the panel created by the sculptors the Sculptors Guild, if you look at the lower part of the panel here, it represents the sculptors working in a workshop. This becomes a beginning of what is sometimes called a sacred conversation. In other words, you get a bunch of people together who are somehow saints or sanctified or holy in some way, and you just put them in the same space, even though historically they may not belong in that space. And in this particular case, these are all figures who in fact were historically alive at the same time. You notice it's called 4 crowned saints, but they don't have any crowns. Well, they're crowned by martyrdom. These are martyred saints that Diocletian killed. Diocletian was one of the last of the more murderous Roman emperors who attacked the Christian faith. And he had commissioned these sculptors to make an antique statue that represented the classical faith. And they refused to do it because they were Christians. So he martyred them. And so that's what you're seeing. These are martyred saints in this beautiful niche. Again, you notice figures are very realistic looking, but they require architecture somehow to be a part of their presentation. And that's what we're going to be watching here, is the movement of sculpture away from architecture to become an important thing in itself. But at this point, that hasn't happened yet. Now, can we see the next one, please? This is part of that same building. This is the gospel writer, St. Mark. It's by Donatello, one of the major figures of the early Renaissance. Michelangelo gets all this credit for being such a great sculptor, which he certainly was. But many things he gets credit for, in fact, Donatello had done before him. Anyway, here's the St. Mark. Now, this is not this statue is not from the Sculptors Guild, but it's the Drapers Guild. And you'll notice St. Mark has a very elaborate robe with lots of folds and so on, because these are the people who are paying for this thing. But the thing I want you to see is, notice he starts to represent St. Mark in a pose that we call contrapposto. It has to do with the dynamic balances that are part of the body. The body is a whole set of dynamic relationships. When one muscle contracts, the other relaxes. When one bone takes a certain weight, the other doesn't take weight. This is what is sometimes called a hip shot pose. So the hips, all the weight is put on the what's called the engaged leg, and this is called the free leg. And then typically the shoulders slightly angle to relate to that. So there's a kind of S-curve in the spine of the figure. It creates a much more lifelike, dynamic look. It's not just appearing anatomically accurate, but it's also behaving the way real anatomy works. It's one of the things that was very much a part of classical sculpture. And you can see Donatello has been able to look at classical sculpture, even though he's dealing with a Christian figure here, he presents him in a way that's clearly indebted to the classical. Now, can we see the next one, please? Unfortunately, this slide is dimmed down a little bit. Look, notice the dimensions here. This is an altarpiece in the International Gothic style. It's in the Uffizi Gallery. It's 9 foot 3 inches across, so it's considerably bigger than the image you see on the screen. And the other thing to be noted, whenever I show you paintings, we can't seem to figure out how come the colors get diminished when we project them on the computer. And that's what's happening here. These colors are much brighter in the real work. I've been there and I've seen the work, and it's a wonderful example of the International Gothic style and Gothic realism. It's, as was a part of the Gothic style, remember, the windows carried much of the important message in the Gothic cathedrals, but they also had these sculptural altar pieces that would be directly behind the altar in the Gothic cathedrals. And this is by an Italian artist, and it's a theme that's very prominent in the Renaissance, the adoration of the Magi. If you look carefully, this is an example of the International Gothic style. You notice how realistically things are represented. For instance, here you have one of the Magi. There's one Magi, two Magi, three. Here's Mary and Jesus and Joseph, the cave, and so on. It's a conflation of time. A lot of people in the Christmas story forget the fact that, in fact, the Magi didn't appear in the Christmas event. If you read the biblical account carefully, they're in a home, in a house. They're not in the cave anymore when the Magi appear. But in any case, what you get is the Magi, of course, represent the powers of this earth, the kings of the earth. And notice they're part of this triumphal train that wanders through these hills, comes around, and eventually comes into the foreground. And notice the beautiful shapes, the elegant poses, but also the lack of gravity. Now, for instance, here's this Magi figure. Here you have an early Renaissance realism. This is a foreshortened figure. What he's doing is taking the spurs off of this figure, and he's not even wearing shoes. Again, the idea of holy ground and so on. So he's taking the spurs off, but it's a servant. But if you look at him carefully, he's foreshortened. Another foreshortening is when you have a hand like this, it's easy to identify it as a hand. When I put it like that, it's much harder to identify it as a hand. This is one of the things Renaissance artists were interested in. How do you represent the real world as it is in space? Not just as flat images, but as a part of a realistic space. So the International style, in fact, is interested in all of these artistic developments, but the overall effect of it is much more fluid and curvilinear and organic. In the lower section of the panel, you have flight into Egypt and so on, but here's a little nativity scene down here. That's a nighttime scene. Again, the idea of what is light like when the sun goes down. But you notice all the gilding here, gold everywhere. And it's a beautiful, grand theme. It's a theme that the Medici chose for their chapel, and Marilyn and I had the possibility of meeting the restorer who restored the Medici chapel and their adoration has several members of the Medici family as part of this train. But the idea is the whole grandeur of the earth comes to meet this little baby. So it's an intensely Christian motif and theme, but done in this fairly organic kind of style. Can we see the next one? This is the Italian way of dealing with these early Renaissance themes of the human body and anatomy. This is Masaccio. Masaccio is regarded as one of the greatest of the early Italian painters. He paints in fresco. Fresco, remember, is a staining technique on plaster. It's a very prominent technique in Florence. When you get up north to the damp climate of Venice, it doesn't work very well, and so they switch to oil painting. But fresco is large-scale painting on wall surfaces, and this is Masaccio's rendition of Adam and Eve and the expulsion from the garden. I love the kind of primitive charm here. Look at this odd scale relationship. You see the size of the figures, and then this funny little doorway here. And I love these little lines coming out of here. Remember, this is expulsion. And they think they're representing God shouting at them, get out of here. And of course, you have the angel represented with his sword, and he's represented in somewhat of a foreshortened way. But most importantly, you want to look at Adam and Eve. Again, the nude bodies, although in this case, they're really naked bodies. They're not nude bodies. Nakedness is a psychological quality more than a physical quality. Nudity is a presentation of the body without any self-conscious quality on part of the figure represented. Nakedness has to do with loss of clothing, and of course, this case, loss of innocence. And you see how he doesn't really fully understand anatomy. The back of Adam is kind of strangely represented. He still hasn't quite figured out all the issues of human proportionality, but he's clearly working at it. And this theme, of course, is important to them because these figures represent qualities not only of human failing and the fall, but of course, the gifts of God in terms of their potential strength and beauty. Can we see the next one, please? This one the color is really diminished. It's not a terribly bright painting anyway, but now it's really diminished. This is again, of course, Masaccio. This is in one of the major churches of Florence, Santa Maria Novella, which is over by the railway station. And it's a wall panel. Remember, the Italian churches generally don't have stained glass windows. And so painting plays more of a role in the Italian churches. And so you often see paintings like this along the side aisles of the Italian churches. Now you notice what's happening here. Let me, first of all, catalog the painting. you have the obvious central figure, the crucified Christ, and then on either side of him, you have the traditional figures at the foot of the cross. This is, of course, Mary. This is St. John. Here are the donors. Donors start to get included in these panels because these things are very, very expensive. And somebody has to pay for it. And so they start to get included. But then what creates a kind of unique space here is you have this beautiful ceiling that has these coffers in it and surrounded by a Roman triumphal arch and then a strange kind of platform here. And on it stands God the Father. And the question I always ask my students is called the Holy Trinity. Where is the Spirit? It's there, but it's not easy to see. Most people see this as a part of God the Father's gown, but it's not. It's the dove itself over Christ's head. And notice what Masaccio has done. He's given us a totally symmetrical vision here, and notice the configuration, a pyramid. That's going to become the classical Renaissance composition. The North never created that whole idea of mathematics and realistic imagery being fused. But the Italians did that, and that, of course, became one of the major features of the Renaissance. And again, as I said, this is fresco, which is not a terribly bright painting technique anyway. And then, of course, this slide is much less bright than the real painting. Can we see the next one, please? This, of course, is the dome of the Duomo, which is, a Duomo is a major cathedral in Italian towns. All of them typically have one major cathedral. They have all kinds of other cathedrals, but the Duomo is your central church, usually right in the middle of town. And the various Tuscan towns competed with each other to create the biggest central church. The Sienese were competing with the Florentines, and they had an idea for this incredibly giant Duomo that they never actually were able to quite complete. The vision was so large. Anyway, the Florentines created this idea of this giant church, which competed to be one of the biggest churches in Christendoms. And the church was done somewhat in a Gothic mode, but of course Italian Gothic, which was never as tall as Northern European Gothic. But they had this tremendous ambition to build this thing, but they never could figure out how to cover the crossing. Remember, the crossing is the intersection. The nave runs east and west. The altar is always on the east end of the nave with the sun rising over the altar. The metaphor is resurrection. And then the transept is, in a Latin cross, is a cross arm, where when those two cross, it becomes a unique kind of space. And so some of the Gothic builders later in the Gothic era started to put a dome there to cover that more expansive space. Well, of course, Italians were doing the same thing. They built this giant cathedral, but they couldn't figure out how to cover the crossing. The dome is 140 feet across. That's about half of a football field. it would be one of the biggest domes ever created by the human race. The Pantheon Dome is 144 feet across. So the cathedral gets built without a dome. And no one can figure out how to cover the crossing. Among other things, domes and arches require what we call centering. They are not able to sustain themselves while they're being built. But at the final moment, you put in a capstone or some other element that closes off the engineering of the form, and all of a sudden it's able to sustain itself. But in order to do that, you have to have a support throughout the whole process. I heard one historian say that it would take all the trees in Tuscany to make centering to cover that dome space. And they weren't going to cut down all the forests in Tuscany to do their cathedral. So Brunelleschi comes along and says, I can do this without centering. He's a brilliant engineer, and as we also saw, a brilliant sculptor. This is part of the whole Renaissance way of approaching things. You have the idea of the artist as a genius, and often they were very smart, very brilliant people, but brilliant in a way that allowed them to move from discipline to discipline. So he's a sculptor and an architect, and he also does painting too. Anyway, he comes up with this idea of a double-structured dome, where you can build the dome without centering. He starts with a structure, a rib structure. By the way, the dome has 8 of these panels to it, and he's stuck with the previous engineering of the cathedral, so they didn't really give him enough buttressing and support at the base here to make a classic half-sphere dome. So he gives us more of a Gothic vertical dome. So the stress of these panels goes more directly downward rather than outward as it does in a classic dome. Anyway, this thing, as you can see, is way, way above the ground. It takes all kinds of elaborate equipment that he invents himself. You get this lantern at the top of the thing, weighs several tons, and that thing, you got to figure out a way, how do you get that up there? It's about 300 feet off the ground. He comes up with a way to do that. Now you'll notice there's something odd about this that I've never quite understood about the Italians. This particular representation doesn't show it, but in fact, around here, there's supposed to be marble paneling with little mini columns around there. That never gets finished. One of these times I'm going to show you San Lorenzo, which is the major cathedral across the street from the Medici Palazzo, and the front of that thing was never finished. Here the Medici looked out the window at this raw, rough brick ashlar facade of this church, and no one bothered to finish off the facade of the church. Here, for some reason or other, these things, there are 1 or 2 of them that show up in other views, but you can see it's unfinished here. But in any case, you can see some of the engineering involved. He came up with a unique way to do the brickwork in the dome. Instead of doing standard brick alignments, he did a kind of cross herringbone pattern. Imagine now if you're a stonemason and you're building this dome for Brunelleschi, and he tells you, we're not going to have any centering. you just start laying bricks. Well, good luck with that. But in any case, that's what they did. And he came up with a way of supporting that dome without any centering. So this whole idea of technical development is a part of this classical way of thinking, but now it's moved to the modern world and much more complex engineering that we ever had in Greco-Roman architecture. Can we see the next one, please? He also designed churches. This is San Spirito, on the other side of the Arno River from the Duomo. And remember, the Italians never got away from the early Christian basilica shape. They still had early Christian basilicas from the Christian era in Italy. And so they never got into the Gothic style quite the way the Northern Europeans did. And so you can, if you look at this, you've got the flat coffered ceiling, which would be typical of an early Christian church. You've got the side aisles with the columned arcades, and then of course the clerestory window. And notice here you don't see any colored light coming through here. Generally, the Italians didn't do a lot of stained glass. Here's where the crossing is. This is a baldacchino, which is a canopy over the altar, and it occurs at the crossing. And here you get a sense of a dome there. It's not a giant dome. The church is nowhere near as big as the Duomo. The thing that's really important about this, that you're probably not conscious of in a direct way, but in fact it shapes your whole sense of order and balance as a part of this building. Everything is done in a modular way. By modular, I mean a fixed system of measurement which you multiply over and over again. So everything is a fraction of everything else. The side aisles, if you put the two side aisles together, they'd be the width of the nave. The verticalities of the sanctuary also becomes modular. And Brunelleschi creates these kind of grand, classic-looking spaces with the idea that this is a world of, remember now, idealistic classical order. And the human being, the genius of the human being, becomes a highlight of this space, a sense of balance, a sense of order. We're honoring God by doing it this way rather than trying to compete with Him and aspire to the heavens. They literally bring heaven down to earth. Now can we see the next one, please? As I've mentioned to you, Donatello is a major sculptor of the early Renaissance. This is his David. The David, by the way, becomes an important theme for the Florentines. Remember, in Italy, you have a bunch of competing city-states. They don't have a national government. They didn't even become a country until the mid-1800s. It's all competing city-states. In this case, in Tuscany, you've got Florence, you've got Pisa, you've got Siena. They all have armies. They all compete against each other. And Florence thought of David as their symbol. As David, of course, is this Christian warrior. Obviously, he's Old Testament, before the time of Christ. But he becomes a progenitor of the Christ. In any case, He uses David as a way of representing the male nude figure. And this figure is truly nude. He's not self-conscious at all about his lack of clothes. Now, something needs to be said here that it gets awkward. I don't want to take this very far. But some of the major artistic figures of the Renaissance are gay men. And this is true of Donatello. It was probably true of Michelangelo. We know for more or less certain it was true of Leonardo. Was probably true of Ghiberti as well. Again, given the social context of the time, these things we have to infer out of various historic evidence and so on. But in any case, you notice he's using the classical contrapposto pose. In fact, he's exaggerating it. Notice how the hips are really shifted over. But also notice the body is represented in a very soft, almost androgynous way. It looks almost as feminine as it does masculine. It's an amazing, elegant composition. By the way, he's standing on the head of Goliath here. He has this, and unfortunately the lighting of this particular image is not good. He wears this helmet with the victor's laurel wreath around the top of it. Normally when you see it in the Bargello, the face is in shadow. And it's almost like he's looking down and as sort of admiring his own body in this introspective way. It's not a representation of a masculine, active, energetic form. It's a much softer, more elegant, introspective image. By the way, he has the stone in this hand, and of course this giant sword. That's Goliath's sword. The scale of the sword and the scale of Goliath's head is meant to help you understand the heroic nature of what he's done. Now, in contrast to that, let's see the next one. Verrocchio is a major sculptor of a generation a little after Donatello, and this is his David. And you notice it gives a very different presentation of David. It looks much more masculine in character. It's much more angular looking, whereas the previous David is sort of self-contained in a kind of columnar shape. Here you get this spiky sword sticking out. His elbows are sharp and angular, sticking out. He's not nude anymore. He's wearing some sort of a Renaissance costume. But of course, here's the giant head of Goliath. By the way, we don't know this for sure, but there's some speculation in the art world that the model for this particular figure is none other than Leonardo. Leonardo was an apprentice in Verrocchio's studio. He came there as a very young man, and Leonardo was a very attractive person, physically attractive, rather tall, rather elegant body, and this might well be Leonardo when he was a much younger man. He's generally known for having the long hair, and you're going to see the long hair again when we see a painting by Raphael. Now, can we see the next one, please? Remember this classical revival I talked about in the Renaissance. They often start to represent classical mythologies, and this particular painting by Botticelli that's in the Uffizi, it's a large painting. Figures are a little over life size. The Birth of Venus. It's actually tempera on canvas. And what you see here is this mythical story of Venus being born on this cockle shell, and she's blown in from the sea by these zephyrs. Zephyrs are embodiments of the winds. And Pomona, who's a representative figure like Flora, representing the spring, cover her. You notice the zephyrs are blowing her to the shore, but you see these rose petals and so on floating in the air. Venus herself, of course, is a nude figure, but in the classical modesty. The Greeks, remember, came to representing the female figure very late in their history. They didn't consider women beautiful, they considered men beautiful. And so only later on did they represent women. And when they did represent women, they commonly represented them as in the bath or something like that. And so they gave them long hair to cover the breasts, and towels and so on to cover the pubic area. And so they created a kind of modest look, even though the figure is without clothes. And so Botticelli is, in fact, giving us that same pose. Again, notice the contrapposto pose. Just amazing, elegant composition. Notice the C-shaped curve here of her body, and then the drapery that's covering her. You get a beautiful kind of arc rhythm here. Again, it's sort of pyramidal, but not quite as pyramidal as many Renaissance composition. In this case, it's more of a domical type of shape. Now, I want to disabuse you of the idealism of the Renaissance. This guy, Botticelli, created these amazing paintings, but he was converted by the preaching of Savonarola, who was a dominant preacher of the time, a dominant monk. And Savonarola thought the Christian faith and this classicism, they don't belong together. So he sponsored what was called the Bonfire of the Vanities. In the center of Florence, there's a large open public forum where Savonarola was himself eventually executed. And the artists were supposed to bring all their work, all their valuable things that had to do with luxury and affluence and everything, and have this giant fire in the central square. Botticelli was a part of this, and he destroyed a lot of his work. And his later work is explicitly Christian. Even though I'm a person of faith, I don't find it remotely as touching as this early, more classical work. Now I'm kind of watching our time here. We're getting a little late. Can we have the next one, please?
Neale, I've seen that painting from 6 feet twice at the Uffizi.
Yeah.
It is a gorgeous painting. The colors are deeper than you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And it's just a gorgeous
Yeah, it's pretty amazing work. And the birth in this Primavera is also in there. It's another painting by Botticelli. Okay, this is Fra Angelico, maybe I'm watching the clock and we're getting a little late today. Maybe this will be a good place to start our next presentation next week when we start to get into the 1500s. Fra Angelico is an amazing figure, and we'll talk about San Marco, the church in which he made this particular painting. It's, of course, an Annunciation. Anyway, we're a little late on our time today. I'd be happy to respond to any questions, but I don't want to keep you from your lunch either. Anyone?
These paintings, I heard around 1500 they started using oil instead of the egg-based pigment. Are these egg-based yet? Or?
These are frescoes. Fra Angelico did usually fresco. He did tempera. He did some wonderful easel paintings as well that are displayed at San Marco. But this is a fresco painting, and we'll say a little more about that next time when we start off with this. Okay, thank you all for coming, folks.